I'm sitting in a courtroom fighting to prove I don't have dementia. The judge is looking at medical records that say I'm mentally incompetent. My son-in-law, Dr. Richard Chun, is sitting across the aisle with his expensive lawyers claiming I'm a danger to myself and need to be locked in a memory care facility. My own daughter Emma is beside him, believing every word he says. 6 months ago, I signed power of attorney documents giving Richard control of my finances. He's a neurologist. He told me I had early-stage dementia. Showed me evaluation results from another doctor confirming the diagnosis. My daughter was crying, begging me to get my affairs in order. While I still could, I believed them. I'm 70 years old. They're doctors. Why wouldn't I believe them? I signed the papers thinking I was being responsible. Thinking I was protecting my daughter from having to make difficult decisions later when I got worse. Then 3 weeks ago, I discovered Richard had liquidated $15 million of my $60 million estate. Sold properties. Moved investments. Opened credit lines. All legally. Using the power of attorney I gave him. When I confronted him, he filed this petition to have me declared fully incompetent.
He wants guardianship.
Wants to place me in a memory care facility called Serenity Hills where I'll be locked away while he systematically steals everything I own. Emma testified this morning that I've declined significantly. That I don't recognize people sometimes. That I get confused about dates and places. Everything she said was based on what Richard told her to watch for. The truth is I don't have dementia. Never did. Richard manufactured the diagnosis to get control of my money. And now I have to prove I'm not sick while fighting my own daughter and a doctor with impeccable credentials. If I lose this hearing, I lose everything. My freedom, my money, my life. If you've ever had someone use your trust against you, or watched a loved one be manipulated by someone they believed in, leave a comment. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the people who claim they're helping you are the most dangerous. Let me tell you how my son-in-law faked a dementia diagnosis to steal my fortune, and how I had to prove I wasn't sick while he controlled everything I owned. I'm 70 years old. Been a widow for 5 years. My late husband David was a tech entrepreneur who built a company from nothing and sold it for $85 million. After taxes and estate settlement, he left me with a $60 million estate. Investments, properties, a portfolio that generated enough income that I'd never have to worry about money for the rest of my life. Did I have one daughter? Emma is 42, married to Richard Chin for 8 years now, and they have 2 kids. Sophie is 10 and James is 7. Emma teaches middle school. She's always been close to me, calls me several times a week, brings the grandkids over every Sunday. We have a good relationship. At least we did. Richard is a neurologist at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. 45 years old, well-respected in his field, impeccable credentials. He and Emma met 8 years ago when Emma brought me to the emergency room after I'd had a minor fall in my garden. Nothing serious, just twisted my ankle, but Emma was worried. Richard was the attending physician. He was attentive and thorough and seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. They started dating a month later. That I liked Richard at first. He was good to Emma, good with the kids, and he always asked detailed questions about my health. Made sure I was taking care of myself, staying active, managing any age-related issues. I thought he was being a caring son-in-law. About a year ago, things started to change. We were having dinner at Emma's house, and I asked her something about Sophie's school schedule. Emma answered me. Then 20 minutes later, I asked the same question again. I honestly didn't remember asking it the first time. Just a normal brain hiccup that everyone has, but Richard noticed. After dinner, I overheard him talking quietly to Emma in the kitchen. He said I'd repeated myself, asked the same question twice. Said it could be nothing or it could be an early warning sign. Emma sounded worried when she asked what kind of warning sign. Richard said memory lapses sometimes indicated cognitive decline, that I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone repeats themselves occasionally. Over the next few months, Richard started documenting everything. I forgot Sophie's piano recital was on Saturday instead of Sunday. I'd written down the wrong date in my calendar. Richard told Emma that confusion about schedules was concerning. I couldn't find my car keys one morning and spent 10 minutes looking for them. Richard said spatial confusion and misplacing objects were classic early symptoms. I called James by the wrong name once when I was tired, called him by my late husband's name by mistake. Richard used the term nominal aphasia and said it was a red flag. Every normal thing that every person my age does occasionally became a symptom when Richard framed it that way 6 months ago. Richard said I needed a cognitive screening. Just a baseline evaluation that everyone my age should have. He made it sound routine and responsible. He took me to a colleague of his, Dr. Stephen Walsh, for a comprehensive evaluation. The appointment lasted 2 hours. Dr. Walsh asked me questions, had me do memory tests and puzzles, evaluated my cognitive function. I thought I did fine. I answered everything, completed all the tasks, felt sharp and present throughout the entire evaluation, but Dr. Walsh seemed concerned. Said he wanted to run some additional tests, look at my results more carefully. I left feeling uneasy, but told myself they were just being thorough. A week later, Richard and Dr. Walsh sat down with me and Emma to discuss the results. Dr. Walsh said I had early-stage dementia, mild cognitive impairment that would likely progress over time. He used words like declining executive function and short-term memory deficits and characteristic patterns consistent with early Alzheimer's disease. Emma started crying. Richard held her hand and looked at me with what seemed like genuine compassion. He said we needed to make plans while I was still capable of making sound decisions. That this disease would get worse, and we needed to be prepared. That I was in shock. I felt fine. I didn't feel like someone whose brain was deteriorating. But 2 doctors were sitting in front of me telling me I had dementia. They knew better than I did, didn't they? They were the experts. Richard brought up power of attorney that same day, said Emma, and he wanted to help me manage things as the disease progressed. That I'd still make all my own decisions, but having POA in place would allow them to step in and help when I needed it. When things got harder, Emma was still crying. She took my hand and begged me to do this. Said she couldn't bear the thought of losing me, of watching me disappear into this disease. She said, please, Mom, while you still can. While you still understand what you're signing, and why heart broke seeing my daughter so upset. I wanted to protect her. Didn't want to be a burden. If I really was sick, if I really was going to decline, then yes, I should get things organized while I could still think clearly. Richard had the paperwork already prepared. Very thorough documents giving him power of attorney over both my medical and financial decisions. He explained each section carefully. Said this was standard, that it would only be used if I became unable to manage my own affairs. That I signed. Gave my son-in-law control over my $60 million estate because 2 doctors told me I had dementia, and my daughter begged me to do it while I still could. That was 6 months ago. For the first few months, nothing really changed. I continued living my life normally, managing my own finances, making my own decisions, doing everything I'd always done. Richard occasionally helped with paperwork, said he was refinancing some properties to get better rates, consolidating some accounts to simplify my portfolio. It all sounded reasonable. He was helping like he'd promised. Emma seemed relieved that I'd accepted the diagnosis and gotten my affairs in order. She started treating me differently, though. Talking more slowly. Over-explaining things. Asking if I remembered conversations we'd just had. It felt patronizing, but I understood she was worried about me. She thought she was losing her mother to this disease. Richard started coming to every family dinner. Said he wanted to keep an eye on me, monitor my condition. I noticed him watching me constantly, noting things down on his phone. Then 3 weeks ago, I had my quarterly meeting with my financial advisor. He seemed confused about some recent transactions. Asked about selling the Portland property. I told him I hadn't sold anything. He said Richard had called 2 weeks earlier, said I decided to liquidate that property and wanted the proceeds transferred to a new account. My stomach dropped. I asked to see my full account statements. Right then, $15 million had been moved, liquidated, or redirected over the past 6 months. Properties sold without my knowledge. Investments cashed out. Credit lines opened in my name. Every transaction authorized by power of attorney. Richard's signature on everything. That I called Richard immediately. Asked him what he'd done with my money. His voice was calm, almost patronizing, when he said we'd discussed all of these moves. That I'd agreed to them. I told him I'd never agreed to any of it. He said this was exactly what Dr. Walsh had warned about, the paranoia, the confusion, The inability to remember decisions I'd made. I wasn't confused. I wasn't paranoid. He'd stolen from me. When I said that, Richard's voice changed, became colder. He said I was getting agitated, and that wasn't healthy. That he and Emma were very worried about me. Then he hung up that I called Emma and told her everything. She sounded sad, not angry. Said Richard had warned her I might react this way. That I might accuse him of things because I couldn't remember agreeing to them. She said the disease was making me paranoid, and she was sorry this was happening. My own daughter thought my accusations were symptoms of dementia. 2 days later, I received court papers. Richard had filed a petition for full guardianship, claimed I was a danger to myself and couldn't manage my own affairs, wanted me declared fully incompetent, wanted authority to place me in a memory care facility. Attached to the petition was a declaration from Dr. Walsh confirming my advanced cognitive decline, a statement from Emma describing my increasing confusion and paranoid accusations, and Richard's detailed documentation of concerning behaviors he'd observed over the past year. That's when I understood. The diagnosis was fake. Richard had manufactured it to get power of attorney. He'd spent 6 months reframing every normal behavior as a symptom. He'd turned my own daughter into an accomplice who genuinely believed I was sick. And now he was using the power I'd given him to steal my fortune and lock me away, so I couldn't stop him. I hired an attorney the day I received Richard's guardianship petition. Found Barbara Wallace, an elder law specialist who'd handled medical fraud cases before. She reviewed everything, and her face went grim. Richard had built an almost perfect case. He was a neurologist with impeccable credentials. He had another doctor's confirming diagnosis. He had my own daughter testifying that she'd witnessed cognitive decline. He had 6 months of documented behaviors interpreted as symptoms. And he had the power of attorney I'd signed voluntarily, proving I'd acknowledged the problem myself. Barbara asked if I'd gotten a second opinion about the dementia diagnosis. I admitted I hadn't. I'd trusted Richard and Dr. Walsh. That was my first mistake. Barbara immediately scheduled me for comprehensive evaluations with 3 independent doctors. Cognitive testing, brain scans, psychiatric evaluation, everything. All 3 doctors reached the same conclusion. I had no signs of dementia, cognitive impairment, or any neurological disease. My memory was excellent for my age. My cognitive function was completely normal. I was sharp, articulate, and showed no indication of decline whatsoever. Barbara used these evaluations to file an emergency motion to revoke the power of attorney and freeze my assets. Argued that the POA had been obtained through fraud, through a fabricated diagnosis designed to manipulate me into signing. Richard's lawyers fought back hard. Filed affidavits from Richard and Dr. Walsh maintaining their diagnosis was accurate. Said the new evaluations were my attempt to deny my illness. Classic dementia behavior, they argued. Patients often refused to accept their diagnosis and sought doctors who would tell them what they wanted to hear. The judge ordered a competency hearing to determine whether I was capable of managing my affairs or whether Richard's guardianship petition should be granted. If Richard won, I'd be declared incompetent and placed in memory care. I'd lose control of everything: my money, my home, my freedom, my life. That I hired a private investigator named Tom Rodriguez who specialized in medical fraud. His first discovery came within a week. Dr. Walsh wasn't just Richard's colleague. They were business partners. They co-owned a consulting company that advised families on elder care placement. They made referral fees from memory care facilities for every patient they placed. Tom found financial records showing Richard and Dr. Walsh had placed 8 patients in memory care facilities over the past 3 years. Each placement generated referral fees ranging from $50,000 to $100,000. This was a business model. Diagnose wealthy elderly patients with dementia, get power of attorney, liquidate assets, place them in expensive care facilities, collect fees. Tom dug deeper into those 8 previous patients. Found that 4 families had later questioned the diagnoses. One family had gotten their father reevaluated and discovered he had no dementia at all. But by then the damage was done. Money spent, the father traumatized by months in memory care. The family had settled quietly with a non-disclosure agreement. Barbara moved to depose those families, but Richard's lawyers blocked it, claiming patient privacy. The judge said we could pursue the information, but it wouldn't be admissible unless families testified willingly. Most had signed NDAs and were terrified of legal consequences. I tried talking to Emma again. Met her for coffee, brought the independent evaluations, begged her to see that Richard was lying. Emma looked at the papers and said the doctors I'd chosen were just telling me what I wanted to hear. That Richard loved me and was trying to protect me. That my insistence I was fine was exactly what Richard had warned would happen: denial and paranoia as the disease progressed. I showed Emma the business records proving Richard and Dr. Walsh profited from memory care placements. Emma's face tightened. She said I was making wild accusations against her husband because I couldn't accept I was sick. Then she said something that broke my heart. "I know you think you're fine, Mom. That's the cruelest part of this disease. You don't even know you're losing yourself." Emma believed every word Richard had told her. He'd turned my own daughter completely against me. Tom discovered something else. Dr. Walsh had been investigated 5 years ago for insurance fraud. Billing for procedures never performed. The investigation was dropped when Walsh paid a settlement and agreed to additional oversight. His medical license was never revoked. Barbara tried to get Walsh's previous fraud investigation admitted as evidence, but the judge ruled it was prejudicial and unrelated to the current case. I was running out of options. Richard controlled my money through the POA. I couldn't access most of my accounts. Barbara was working essentially pro bono because I couldn't pay her properly. Meanwhile, Richard's lawyers were painting me as exactly what he'd claimed: a woman with dementia who refused to accept her diagnosis, who was making increasingly paranoid accusations against family members trying to help her. 2 weeks before the competency hearing, Tom found the smoking gun. He'd been investigating Dr. Walsh's financial records and found unusual payments from a memory care facility called Serenity Hills. Monthly payments of $15,000 for 3 years. Payments labeled as consulting fees, but far too large and regular to be legitimate. Tom interviewed staff at Serenity Hills. Found a nurse willing to talk off the record. She said Dr. Walsh and Richard Chun had a deal with the facility. They diagnose wealthy patients with dementia, get power of attorney, place them at Serenity Hills, and receive kickbacks for every patient admitted. The facility charged exorbitant rates, $15,000 per month, knowing families were paying with the patient's own money that the doctors controlled. The nurse said she'd seen patients who seemed perfectly healthy, who didn't belong in memory care, who cried and begged to go home, but whose families were told this was standard resistance behavior. She'd quit 6 months ago because she couldn't ethically participate anymore. Barbara got the nurse to agree to testify at the competency hearing. It was risky, but the nurse said she couldn't let it keep happening. That I also discovered where my $15 million had gone. Richard had moved it to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Legal to move as POA, but suspicious as hell. He'd paid himself management fees of $200,000 for handling my estate, and made a $3 million deposit for future care expenses at Serenity Hills. He'd already arranged my placement. Already paid for 2 years of memory care with my own money. He wasn't planning to steal the $60 million all at once. He was going to steal it gradually by billing my estate for care I didn't need while collecting kickbacks from the facility. The competency hearing was scheduled for Monday. I had 3 independent evaluations proving I was healthy, evidence of Richard's financial fraud, testimony from the nurse about the Serenity Hills scheme, and proof of previous victims. But Richard had the initial diagnosis from 2 doctors, Emma's testimony about my decline, 6 months of documented behaviors, and the POA I'd signed voluntarily. Barbara warned me that competency hearings were unpredictable. Judges were cautious about overruling medical opinions. Richard's credentials and Emma's testimony carried enormous weight. Even with everything we'd found, there was a real chance I'd lose. If I lost, I'd be declared incompetent. Richard would become my legal guardian. He'd place me in Serenity Hills and systematically drain my estate while I was locked in memory care, unable to stop him, and Emma would never know her husband had destroyed her mother's life for money. The weekend before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Emma, about how completely Richard had manipulated her. She genuinely believed I had dementia. Every conversation we'd had over the past year, She'd been watching for symptoms Richard told her to see. Barbara suggested I record a video statement. Just in case the hearing went badly, at least there would be evidence of my competency. I sat in front of my laptop and recorded myself discussing current events, reciting my life history, explaining my finances in detail. I discussed Richard's fraud, the fake diagnosis, the money he'd stolen. I saved the video in multiple locations. If Richard locked me away in Serenity Hills, at least there would be proof I'd been competent. Sunday afternoon, my sister Helen called from Boston. She said Emma had called her asking if Helen had noticed anything wrong with me lately. Emma was having doubts. She'd been looking through old family photos and found one from 3 months ago at Sophie's birthday party. I looked happy and completely normal. Emma was questioning whether I was really as sick as Richard claimed, and my heart leaped. Helen said she'd told Emma that I seemed perfectly fine every time they talked. Emma had been quiet before saying she needed to think about everything. I wanted desperately to call Emma, but Barbara advised against it. Any contact could be used to claim I was pressuring her, manipulating my daughter. That night, Tom called with news. He'd found another victim. Patricia Morse, whose father had been diagnosed with dementia by Dr. Walsh 2 years ago. Patricia had signed an NDA but was willing to break it and testify. Her father had been placed in Serenity Hills and died there 6 months later. His autopsy showed no signs of neurological disease. But $200,000 of his estate had been paid to Serenity Hills for care he didn't need. Patricia said she'd pay any legal penalties if it meant stopping Richard and Walsh. Barbara immediately added her as a witness. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Wanted to look confident, healthy. I met Barbara at the courthouse 2 hours early. Barbara reviewed the strategy. We'd start with my independent evaluations, then Patricia to establish the pattern, then the Serenity Hills nurse to expose the kickback scheme, then the financial evidence. Richard arrived with his lawyers and Emma. Emma looked exhausted, like she'd been crying. She wouldn't make eye contact with me. Richard looked confident. The judge called the hearing to order. Richard's lawyers went first. Dr. Walsh testified about his diagnosis, the tests he said I'd failed, the clear signs of impairment. He spoke with complete authority, using medical terminology. He sounded utterly convincing. Then Richard testified about watching me decline. About my forgetfulness, confusion, paranoid accusations. He looked at the judge and said he loved me but I needed professional care before I hurt myself. Finally, Emma testified. I watched my daughter describe all the moments Richard had coached her to see as symptoms. Her voice shook as she said I'd declined significantly, sometimes didn't recognize the grandchildren, got confused about what year it was. Every word was exaggerated or fabricated, but Emma believed it because Richard had convinced her. Then Barbara's turn. She put my 3 independent doctors on the stand. Each testified that I showed no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. All 3 flatly contradicted Walsh's diagnosis. Barbara asked if dementia could be missed by 3 specialists. Each said no. If I had dementia severe enough for guardianship, they'd have seen clear evidence. Then Barbara called Patricia Morse. Patricia testified about her father's fake diagnosis, about Walsh and Richard placing him in Serenity Hills, about discovering after his death he'd never been sick. She broke down crying, saying they'd stolen her father's final months. Richard's lawyers tried to have her testimony thrown out, but the judge allowed it as evidence of a pattern. Barbara called the Serenity Hills nurse next. She testified about the kickback scheme, about Richard and Walsh receiving payments for placements, about healthy patients held in memory care against their will. Then Barbara presented the financial evidence. Showed how Richard had liquidated $15 million, moved money offshore, paid himself fees, and prepaid for my placement at Serenity Hills. I watched the judge's face change as the evidence mounted. Skepticism became concern, became anger. Finally, Barbara put me on the stand. I spoke clearly and precisely. Described how Richard had manufactured symptoms from normal behaviors, how he'd convinced Emma I was sick, how I'd trusted him and signed the POA, how I discovered the theft. I looked at Emma while I testified. Emma was crying, hands over her face. Richard's lawyer cross-examined aggressively. Asked if I remembered specific events from months ago. I answered every question perfectly. He tried to trip me up with dates and details. I never faltered. He asked if I was paranoid about my son-in-law. I said no. I had evidence he was stealing. That wasn't paranoia, it was fact. The cross-examination fell apart. I was too sharp, too clear, too obviously competent. The judge called a recess to review the evidence that I sat with Barbara in the hallway. Across from us, Richard was talking intensely with his lawyers. Emma stood apart, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then Emma walked over. She sat down next to me and said 4 words. "Tell me the truth." I took Emma's hands and told her everything. Not the legal version, but the raw truth. How Richard had spent a year reframing every normal thing I did as a symptom. How he'd used her love for me against her, made her into an unwitting accomplice. How the power of attorney was based on a manufactured diagnosis. How he'd stolen $15 million and was planning to lock me away and drain the rest. Emma's face went through a dozen emotions. Denial first, no, Richard was a doctor, he wouldn't lie. Then confusion, but the evaluation, Dr. Walsh had confirmed it. Then the slow, horrible realization as pieces clicked together. Emma whispered that Richard had been so insistent she watched for signs. That he'd point out moments I didn't remember conversations, or got dates confused. That he'd shown her articles about how dementia patients denied their diagnosis. He'd coached her on what to see and she'd seen it. I said gently that Richard was very good at manipulation. That he'd done this to other families. That she wasn't stupid. She was a daughter who'd trusted her husband when he said her mother was sick. Emma asked about the money. I showed her the financial documents. Emma stared at numbers representing my fortune being systematically stolen by her husband. Then Emma said something that broke my heart. He was going to lock you away. While I thought I was helping you, I would have visited you there thinking you were sick. Would have brought the kids to see you locked up and told them grandma has dementia. And it would all have been a lie. I held my daughter while she cried. When we went back into the courtroom, Emma asked to speak to the judge. Said she needed to revise her testimony. Richard's face went white. His lawyers objected, but the judge said he'd hear what Emma had to say. Emma took the stand again and told the truth. Said she'd believed her husband when he told her to watch for symptoms. That she'd interpreted normal behaviors as disease because Richard had coached her. That seeing the financial evidence and hearing other victims made her realize she'd been manipulated. That her mother was not sick and had never been sick. Richard's lawyer argued that Emma was now being manipulated by me. But Emma cut him off. Said she was a teacher, not an idiot, and she knew the difference between manipulation and evidence of fraud. The judge asked Emma directly, "Are you saying Dr. Chen lied to you about your mother's condition?" Emma looked at Richard, her husband of 8 years, father of her children, and said yes. That he'd lied, used her, turned her against her own mother for money. The judge took a 30-minute recess. When he returned, his ruling was swift and harsh. He found that the dementia diagnosis was fabricated. That Richard Chen and Stephen Walsh had engaged in a pattern of fraud targeting elderly patients. That Richard had obtained power of attorney through deception and used it to steal. That I was clearly competent and had been throughout. He immediately revoked Richard's power of attorney. Issued an emergency order freezing my accounts and demanding full accounting of every transaction. Ordered return of all liquidated funds. Referred Richard and Walsh to the State Medical Board for investigation. Referred the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. He dismissed Richard's guardianship petition entirely and ordered Richard to have no contact with me or my finances. Richard stood up, face red, and shouted that this was a miscarriage of justice. That I'd manipulated everyone, that I was sick and dangerous. The judge told Richard to sit down or be held in contempt. Richard's lawyers pulled him back into his seat. Barbara immediately filed criminal complaints against Richard and Walsh. The district attorney said his office would investigate fully. Outside the courtroom, reporters had gathered. I gave a brief statement warning other families to be cautious about medical diagnoses used to justify giving power of attorney. Emma stood with me, her hand in mine, visibly aligned with her mother against her husband. The medical board launched investigations within a week. Found evidence of the kickback scheme with Serenity Hills. Found other victims, the pattern of fake diagnoses, the systematic fraud. Both doctors had their licenses immediately suspended. The district attorney filed criminal charges: elder abuse, fraud, theft, conspiracy. Richard and Walsh were arrested, posted bail, and hired expensive defense attorneys. Serenity Hills was raided. Investigators found financial records documenting kickback payments. Found patients placed there under questionable diagnoses. The facility was shut down and all patients were re-evaluated. 3 of them had no dementia at all. Emma filed for divorce 3 days after the hearing. Moved herself and the kids back in with me temporarily. Sophie and James were confused. Emma told them age-appropriately that Dad had made very bad choices and they needed time apart. Richard fought the divorce, claimed Emma was being manipulated. But Emma was resolute. Said she couldn't be married to someone who'd tried to lock her mother away to steal her money. The financial recovery was complex. Barbara worked with forensic accountants to trace everything. They recovered $12 million of the $15 million. The other $3 million was hidden in accounts they might recover eventually. Richard's trial was set for 6 months later. The evidence was overwhelming: victims, kickback scheme, financial theft, fabricated diagnosis. His lawyers tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA wasn't interested. Patricia Morse filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Richard, Walsh, and the facility. Other victims came forward with their own lawsuits. Richard was facing criminal prosecution and civil liability that would bankrupt him. Emma struggled with guilt. Kept apologizing for not seeing the truth sooner, for testifying against me. I told her over and over that Richard had manipulated everyone, that she was a victim too. But late at night I'd hear Emma crying in the guest room, processing the betrayal, grieving the marriage built on lies. The hardest part was Sophie and James. They loved their father. Didn't understand why Grandma and Mom were saying Dad had done bad things. Richard told them during visitation that Grandma was lying, that she was sick and confused. I had to watch my grandchildren be used as weapons in Richard's attempt to salvage his reputation. 6 months later, Richard's criminal trial began. I testified about the fake diagnosis, the fraudulent power of attorney, the theft. Emma testified about the manipulation. Patricia testified about her father's death. The Serenity Hills nurse testified about the kickback scheme. Richard's defense was that he genuinely believed I had dementia, that Dr. Walsh's diagnosis was legitimate, that he'd managed my affairs in good faith. But the kickback scheme destroyed that defense. The jury saw Richard wasn't a concerned son-in-law. He was a predator running a scam. They convicted him on all counts: elder abuse, fraud, theft, conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison and ordered full restitution plus damages. Dr. Walsh got 10 years. Serenity Hills administrators got various sentences. Richard's medical license was permanently revoked. They led Richard out in handcuffs. He looked at Emma and said she'd destroyed their family, that she'd chosen her mother's money over her children's father. Emma looked him in the eye and said no, he'd destroy their family when he tried to lock her mother away to steal from her. That she'd chosen truth over lies and she'd make that choice every time. I squeezed my daughter's hand, proud of the strength Emma had found. 2 years after Richard went to prison, I was 72 and Emma was 44. We'd rebuilt our lives in the aftermath of his fraud. Emma had finished her divorce, sold the house she'd shared with Richard, and bought a smaller place near me. Sophie and James, now 12 and 9, split time between Emma's house and Richard's parents' house for visitation. Richard called from prison sometimes, but the kids were increasingly uncomfortable talking to him. They knew what he'd done, understood in kid terms that Dad had tried to hurt Grandma. I'd recovered most of my money. The $12 million retrieved during investigation, plus another $2 million traced through offshore accounts over the following months. Still missing about $1 million that Richard had hidden, so, well, even forensic accountants couldn't find it. I considered it the cost of escaping his scheme alive and free. I'd updated my estate plan with ironclad provisions. No power of attorney could be granted without evaluations from 3 independent doctors and court oversight. Emma was trustee, but with strict limitations requiring court approval for major transactions. I would never again be that vulnerable. The medical board investigation found 7 other victims of Richard and Walsh's scheme. All elderly, all diagnosed with dementia they didn't have, all with power of attorney signed over, all with money systematically stolen. Total theft across all victims, over $40 million. Some families recovered funds, others didn't. I used part of my recovered money to start a foundation for elder abuse victims. Provided legal help to families fighting fraudulent guardianships or power of attorney abuse. Advocated for stronger laws around cognitive evaluations. Educated seniors about warning signs of medical fraud. Emma became an advocate too. Spoke publicly about how she'd been manipulated into believing her mother was sick. Warned other families about the tactics predators used. Said the hardest part was forgiving herself for enabling Richard's fraud. Sophie and James called me every Sunday. Visited every weekend. They knew their father was in prison, but they were being raised by Emma and me with love and stability. They were doing okay despite everything. Richard wrote to me once from prison. Said he was sorry for what he'd done, that he'd gotten caught up in greed, that he'd never meant to hurt me. I read the letter once and threw it away. Sorry didn't undo the year I'd spent fighting his fraud. Sorry didn't give back the time I'd lost, the relationship with Emma that had been damaged. I never wrote back. On my 72nd birthday, I sat on my porch with Emma and the grandchildren. Sophie had made a cake. James had drawn me a picture. Emma had given me flowers. I looked at my daughter, strong, resilient, recovered from devastating betrayal, and felt proud. Emma had chosen truth over loyalty to a bad husband. Had chosen to protect her mother over preserving her marriage. We'd survived. Both of us. And built something good from the wreckage Richard had tried to create. The foundation I'd started helped 3 families that year escape fraudulent guardianships. 3 elderly people who'd been diagnosed with dementia they didn't have, who'd been facing institutionalization by family members trying to steal from them. My story gave them hope and my money gave them legal resources to fight back. Richard would be eligible for parole in 8 years. He'd be 53. His medical career destroyed, his marriage ended, his relationship with his children damaged. I didn't take satisfaction in his suffering, but I didn't regret it either. He'd made his choices. These were the consequences. Emma asked once if I would ever forgive Richard. I said I didn't think about him enough to forgive him. He wasn't worth the emotional energy. I'd moved on and built a life he couldn't touch anymore. That was its own form of victory. On holidays, when the family gathered, there was no place set for Richard. Sophie and James knew they had a father in prison, but he wasn't part of their daily lives. Emma had started dating someone new, a high school principal who was kind and honest and had no interest in my money. Life went on. I updated my will one final time. Left the bulk of my estate to Emma and the grandchildren with strict protections. Left $5 million to the Elder Abuse Foundation. Left specific amounts to the other victims of Richard's scheme, the families who hadn't recovered their money. I'd been lucky. I'd had the resources to fight back. Not everyone did. 10 years after the competency hearing, I was 80. Emma was 52. Sophie was 20. James was 17. Both kids were in college, doing well, had grown up normal despite their father's crimes. I thought sometimes about the sliding doors moment. What would have happened if I hadn't questioned the diagnosis? I would have been placed in Serenity Hills, died there thinking I was sick when I was perfectly healthy. Emma would have visited faithfully, brought the grandchildren, never knowing her husband had destroyed her mother for money. The truth would never have come out, but I had questioned, had fought, had refused to accept a diagnosis that didn't match my experience of my own mind. That resistance had saved my life. I told that to every family who called the foundation seeking help. Trust your gut. If you know you're not sick, fight like hell to prove it. Don't let anyone lock you away based on a diagnosis that doesn't feel right. Some people listened. Some people were saved. Others called too late, already institutionalized, already stripped of authority. I helped as many as I could. On my 80th birthday, surrounded by family, I made a toast. To truth over manipulation. To fighting for your own mind when others try to take it. To daughters who choose right over easy. To surviving predators who come disguised as help. Emma cried and hugged me tight. Said I was the strongest person she knew. That I disagreed. Emma was the strong one. Emma had to admit her husband was a monster. Blow up her life to protect her mother, raise 2 kids alone. We were both strong. We'd had to be, and we'd both survived.